Okay guys, today we are starting Unit 7, so you should read the PowerPoint slides first so that you can have an idea of what we're talking about. We're going to be doing the first half of Unit 7 this week, and next week we'll be doing the second half. So we're going up to about slide 35, 36 or so in Unit 7. I'm not going to go 100% in order. I'm going to try to put it in a slightly different order so that we can put it all together in different ways in your mind. So make sure that you've read over the slides carefully so that you can follow along without having to go back and look at the slides a whole lot of times while we go through the lecture. Okay, so first things first, we need to start with just the general structure of a typical neuron. So I have drawn here just a typical neuron. Where we have the cell body or the soma, which is where you'll find the nucleus and most of the typical cellular organelles. Neurons are lacking some cellular organelles, such as the ones that are required for reproduction. So a neuron, for example, won't have any centrioles because it doesn't reproduce. So you don't make new neurons from one neuron dividing into another. Now on the cell body, you'll have extensions sticking out, and I made them kind of thick, but really they're really thin and hair-like extensions, and these are called dendrites. And coming off of each of the dendrites, you'll have even smaller hair-like extensions. The cat's talking. And these are called dendritic spines here. So they'll be sticking off of the dendrites. Now the cell body is going to narrow into almost kind of like a triangular sort of area right here, and that's called the axon hillock. And then once it narrows completely into this long thin extension, this is called the axon. Right here, right at the beginning of the axon, right where we transition from the axon hillock into the axon itself, that's called the initial segment of the axon. We're getting photobombed here by go on. So on the initial segment of the axon, this is where we're going to find a change in the types of protein channels that we have on the cell membrane. So on the cell body over here, we're going to have a certain type of protein channel that allows ions to move across the cell membrane, which we talked about in the first unit way back when. There'll be a very particular kind on the cell body here, and on the dendrites and on the dendritic spines. Then once we transition into the axon, starting at the initial segment and all the way down to the end of the neuron, we'll have a very different kind of protein channel for ions to move across. And we'll get into all the details of that throughout this lecture here. Here's the cat again. So as the axon gets down to the bottom, it's going to, or to the end of it, it's going to split off into multiple branches, and these are called telodendria. And these can be quite long also. And they're going to all end in these little bulges here that are called the synaptic knobs. And on the synaptic knobs, or in the synaptic knobs, you'll find vesicles that contain neurotransmitter. So what happens in general when your neurons are signaling to each other? And cell signaling just means cells communicating with each other. So that's what neurons are for. They're for communication from one cell to another. So what will happen is there will be a stimulus that will excite the cell, and we'll understand the stimulus by the end of the second video today. But it's going to have what's called an action potential, which is an electrical stimulus that shoots down the axon. And the action potential, when it reaches the end of the axon, it gets to the synaptic knobs, it causes the release of the neurotransmitter. So the neurotransmitter is then coming out of the synaptic knobs and going into a space which is called the synapse down here. So down here I've drawn two neurons, just kind of stick figures of them. This would be one of those, and here's the second one. So this one had its action potential. It released the neurotransmitter into the synapse, which is a very small space. It's not nearly as big as what I've made it look. So now we have neurotransmitter out here in this space. On the second neuron, we would have receptors. I put one, there would be many. And these receptors will be specific for this neurotransmitter. So let's say, for example, that this neurotransmitter is acetylcholine. That's a common one. the receptor for this would be something called a cholinergic receptor to bind the acetylcholine. And you don't have to write that down. It's not on the slides yet. We will get to that eventually. The different types of neurotransmitter, different receptors, and it could be many different receptors. If this was acetylcholine, there are 4 different types of receptors that we'll be talking about that could bind that acetylcholine. But it has to be one that is specific for the acetylcholine, or whatever neurotransmitter this happens to be. Now, because we have a synapse here, and this neuron is before the synapse, and this neuron is after the synapse, we can use some terminology here by calling this one the presynaptic neuron, and this one over here would be the postsynaptic neuron. Okay, and communication always goes from the presynaptic one to the postsynaptic one because it's all having to do with this neurotransmitter, which is released at the end here, so we can't communicate backwards. Okay, so that was one type of neuron that I drew, and here are some stick figures of neurons again showing different types of neurons, and this is the one that we just drew. This is called a multipolar neuron, and for example, where you would see this would be in motor neurons. Motor neurons are neurons that are going out from the brain or the spinal cord. They are going to stimulate muscle or glands, so they're causing some sort of movement or effect. So that would be the shape that they will be. They'll be multipolar in shape. So you have the cell body with the dendrite sticking out, the axon going out the other end. For the bipolar neurons, here they have an axon on one end, the cell body in the middle, and then coming off the other end we have dendrites sort of extended off of the cell body there. These will be sensory neurons only, so sensory neurons are neurons that have information from the environment coming in, going into the brain and the spinal cord, but there'll be a very specific type of sensory neuron found only in the special senses. We haven't gotten to special senses, but they're all centered around your head. They're very specialized, which is why they're called special senses. Their sight, hearing, equilibrium, gustation, which is taste, and olfaction, which is smell. These bipolar neurons are specifically in sight and olfaction. So that would be an example of where you'd find bipolar neurons. Up here, anaxonic neurons. The word anaxonic, it literally means no axon, which is a bit of a misnomer because there is in fact an axon. It just looks exactly like the dendrite. So if you were just to look at it under a microscope, you would be hard pressed to tell which was the axon and which were the dendrites. You would have to go in and be able to see the ion channels to see what type of ion channels you had. Remember I said that you have a certain kind of channel on the cell body and a different kind of channel on the axon. So that would be the only way you could tell, is by the presence of that different type of channel on the axon for these guys. Okay, and the last one, unipolar neurons. Oh, wait, where do we find, let's give the example where we find the anaxonic neurons. These are in the central nervous system only. So central nervous system is abbreviated as CNS. That's your brain and your spinal cord. And they serve as something called interneurons, which just means neurons between other neurons. So they'll be interspersed between one neuron and another neuron. So they help another neuron communicate with either one more neuron or many more neurons. And we saw these actually when we were doing reflexes. So if you've watched the reflex video, which hopefully you have because that was last week, we saw when we had polysynaptic reflexes, we saw interneurons. Those were the neurons that connected the sensory neuron coming in to the motor neuron going out. Now that should also bring you to thinking back to that reflexes lecture, that I drew the motor neuron looking just like that because it's a multipolar neuron. And I drew the sensory neuron looking just like this, which is a unipolar neuron. So this is very specifically what we call somatic sensory neurons. And somatic means of the body. When something is somatic, it's something that tends to be able to go into your consciousness, so a sense that could be consciously sensed. It doesn't mean that you necessarily sense it all the time, but it could be sensed consciously. So things like temperature, touch, vibration, things like that, those are all what we call the general senses. If you think back to like the skin unit when we were talking about the touch receptors, those would be somatic sensory neurons, and they would look just like this. And they consist of the dendrites, and the dendrites here would be acting as a receptor. So they receive the sense. So this could be out in your skin, receiving the sense of touch. Then the dendrite will go all the way up into the cell body, which will be found in a place very close to the spinal cord called the dorsal root ganglion, which we're going to spinal cord anatomy next, so this will be explained further. You'll see exactly where that is. So that cell body, the soma, is in the dorsal root ganglion. Then the axon goes into the spinal cord and up towards your brain to bring the information that you have sent something towards your brain. Okay? So those are our types of neurons and our shapes of neurons. So let's get into spinal cord anatomy now. So I have drawn a spinal cord here. Two things to think about before we get into the spinal cord itself. Gray matter and white matter. Gray matter is referring to areas of the brain or spinal cord or anywhere in the nervous system where you have cell bodies. The cell bodies appear darker in color, so when you look at them under a microscope, or even if you have a brain slice, you don't need a microscope. You can see on the outer shell of the brain, you can see that it looks darker, and that would be called the cerebral cortex. If you're looking in the spinal cord, it looks darker on the inside, like I've drawn here, and those are called the horns, and that's where you're going to find the cell bodies. Now the white matter is where we have axons. Axons have cells that create something called a myelin sheath around them. We'll get to that. That'll be in the next video. But in a nutshell, it's just these lighter color cells that wrap themselves around axons and help the axon have action potentials faster. So that's why we call white matter, or that's why we call axons white matter, and they just appear lighter in color when you look at them. So if we look at the spinal cord here, everywhere where it's just kind of light, that would be white matter. And in the spinal cord, we call them columns, where we have axons going up and down in the spinal cord. Now, another thing to think about would be this terminology down here, ganglia versus nuclei. So one ganglion, more than one ganglia, and one nucleus, more than one nuclei. So for a ganglion, what a ganglion is, it's just a cluster of cell bodies, and they're found in the peripheral nervous system. So anything that's not the brain or the spinal cord. When you have the same situation, but it's in the central nervous system, so just clusters of cell bodies in the brain or the spinal cord, that's called a nucleus. Okay, so let's look at the spinal cord. When we're looking at this picture, it's like we're looking at it from above. So you took the spinal cord and you just kind of chucked it side to side so that you can look at, you know, the top would be looking up and looking down on it would be this way. So your back would be over here, your belly would be over here. So let's start with the horns, the dark matter, where we have cell bodies. We call the horns just whether they're in the back, the side, or the front. So we have the posterior horns in the back, the lateral horns on the sides, and the anterior horns in the front. The columns, we already mentioned those. That's where we have axons, and they're named whether they're in the back, the side, the front, just like the horns are. So the posterior column, the lateral column, and the anterior column in the front. And it would be mirror image on the same side. Now, here, this is the dorsal root ganglion. This is not in the spinal cord. It's going towards the spinal cord. Your vertebrae would be right about there. So it's encased within the protective shell of the vertebrae, but it's not technically part of the central nervous system, so that's why it's called the dorsal root ganglion and not the dorsal root nucleus. Here is where you're going to find cell bodies for these unipolar neurons. So let's put one in. It's a different color. So there's a unipolar neuron. Here's its dendrite. It goes out this way, acts as a receptor, say a touch receptor, for example. And then its axon goes in to the spinal cord. Now it's all happening in the back. So the cell body's in the dorsal root ganglion, which is on this kind of offshoot of the spinal cord, which is called the dorsal root. And the word dorsal and posterior are interchangeable, so I'm switching back and forth between the terminology so that you can recognize them in either way. So you could call this the posterior root and the posterior root ganglion, just like you could call this the dorsal horn and the dorsal column. It's just whichever one you prefer. So anyway, the cell body of the unipolar sensory neuron is sitting there in the dorsal root ganglion. There's its receptor out there in the skin somewhere or somewhere else in the body. And it brings that information in. The axon goes in to the posterior column and goes up towards the brain. So everything in the back here, what we've dealt with, it's all sensory. We've got sensory information coming in to the dorsal root through the dorsal root ganglion and then up the back in the posterior column or the dorsal column. So it's all sensory in the back. Now for the front, we have the ventral root here. So that doesn't have a ganglion on it, but what it does have would be axons for motor neurons, and I'll put one where it would be. There's the cell body for a multipolar neuron, which is a motor neuron. There's the cell body in the anterior horn of the spinal cord, which is the case for certain types of motor neurons, somatic ones, so we'll get to that. And its axon goes out through the ventral root and then all the way out through once the roots join. So once we have the dorsal root and the ventral root join, then we have a spinal nerve that goes out from the vertebrae. There's a line where the vertebrae would be, and then branches out into the body. Okay. Now, there is a little bit of interesting things that happen along the ventral root, which I did not draw on here. But when we get to the next unit, we are going to get into things that come off of here. Kind of like this. Little ganglion out here with little bridges that hook it to the ventral root. This all has to do with the autonomic nervous system, which is dealing with smooth muscle, cardiac, glands, things like that. So we'll get into that with our next unit. But for now, all we need to think about in terms of the autonomic motor system is the arrangement of it. So keep in mind, remember that we saw motor in the front, so all motor in the ventral or the anterior part of the spinal cord, and we had sensory all going in the back. And when we start thinking about just motor, we're dealing just with the front and a little bit on the sides. So the sides, the lateral sides will be a little bit sensory, a little bit motor, kind of a mix there. But when we start thinking about just motor, we're going to be dealing with just the anterior horns, the anterior root, and then the spinal nerve, of course. So when we look at motor, we've got two main divisions of motor. We have autonomic motor and we have somatic motor. Autonomic motor is dealing with cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, or glands, things that cannot be consciously controlled, while somatic motor is dealing with skeletal muscle, things that can be consciously controlled, like your biceps brachii or your trapezius muscle, something that you say, I want to move that, and then you move that. So in both of these situations, for both of these systems, we're going to have two neurons, an upper motor neuron and a lower motor neuron. And for once in anatomy and physiology, these things mean exactly what they sound like. This one's on top, this one's on the bottom. So this will be in your brain, most likely. Occasionally it can be deeper in the spinal cord, but mostly it's in the brain. The lower motor neuron is going to be either in the spinal cord or outside of the spinal cord, but in the body, depending on which system we're talking about. So let's look at autonomic motor. here's our brain up here, here's the spinal cord, just, stick figures of these two structures. So the upper motor neuron is going to be somewhere deep in the brain stem. And the brain stem consists of your medulla oblongata, which you've probably all already heard of. It's right at the base of your skull. And then just above that is a structure called the pons. These both deal with autonomic processes like your heart beating, your breathing rates, things like that. So this is where you're going to find most of your autonomic upper motor neurons. Now sometimes this autonomic upper motor neuron will be found down in the spinal cord in the anterior or the lateral horns. Remember, motor all in the front, sometimes the sides, never the back. So sometimes we might find that there, but generally most of them are going to be found in the brain stem. So following the upper motor neuron, there's its cell body, and it's multipolar in shape. All motor neurons are multipolar in shape. And the axon's going to go down through the spinal cord using the anterior column or the lateral column, and it's going to go out of the spinal cord using the ventral root. So here's the axon coming down here and going out this way to the spinal nerve. But it's going to take a turn. We're not going to worry so much about that. It's going to deal with this situation down here where it's going to meet up with its lower motor neuron. And that lower motor neuron is found in an autonomic ganglion that is outside of the spinal cord. So it would be right around there. Or it might be in front of the spinal cord. Or it might be way, way, way out, all the way in the organ, or right on top of the organ, very close to the organ. So there's a couple of different places this lower motor neuron could be, but it's always going to be in a group of other lower motor neurons, so it's always in a ganglion, and they're always all autonomic, so that's why it's called an autonomic ganglion. It will never be in the spinal cord. Then that lower motor neuron, its cell body in the ganglion, its axon goes out, and it goes towards the effector, which will be cardiac muscle, which we have here, smooth muscle, or a gland. Now contrast that to the somatic motor, so going to, say, your biceps brachii. Say you want to do bicep curls, and you think, I'm going to do a bicep curl, and then you do it. That upper motor neuron is going to be found in the cerebral cortex, so on the outer shell of your brain. Actually right at the tip top, kind of like right where, if you were wearing a headband, anywhere where that headband is, right under that headband would be right about where that upper motor neuron for somatic motor would be found. Then as axon goes down through the brain, down through, again, the anterior column, possibly the lateral column, but more likely for the somatic motor, the anterior column. And it's going to meet up with its lower motor neuron. This lower motor neuron is in the spinal cord. It's in the anterior horn of the spinal cord. So that cell body, that would be that. That's a somatic motor neuron right there. That's the only thing it could be. That axon then goes out through the ventral root, through a spinal nerve, so going out towards the effector, which will be skeletal muscle in our example, the biceps brachii. The specific synapse between this muscle and the lower motor neuron in the somatic system is called the motor end plate. So I just put that there for you to see. Okay, we've seen the motor end plate before when we did the muscle unit. Okay, so that is the general arrangement of the system. Our next video is going to deal with the transmembrane potential and ion movements and things like that. So we'll end here and we'll pick up again with that.